Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. I'm Stacia Garr. Today's guest is Dr. Ben Granger, who's the Chief Workplace Psychologist at Qualtrics, and, more relevant for our conversation today, the author of the new book, A Leader Worth Following: How to Master Yourself, Influence Others, and Create Exceptional Experiences. And I want to take just a few minutes before you hear the conversation to share why I think this one is especially worth your time. Ben came to this book in a way that is pretty interesting. He wasn't trying to write a leadership book. What he was doing was like so many of us researchers do, and that he was just digging into the data, trying to understand what distinguishes the companies that produce great employee experiences, great customer experiences, and strong financial performance all at the same time. So clearly he was looking for the silver bullet. And for him, that answer kept surfacing: leadership. Something different about how the leaders in those companies led. And this sent him down a research rabbit hole that eventually became this book. He pulled from evolutionary psychology, from neuroscience, from anthropology, even from physics. It's not a typical business book, and this is not your sort of typical podcast interview, largely because Danny and I are also researchers who have worked long in the space, and so we had just a ton of questions. So one of the things I keep coming back to was his distinction between prestige-based and dominance-based leadership. And what he does is he draws from evolutionary psychology and finds that every social animal uses dominance. So crickets, primates, wolves, they all have alphas who impose their will on others. But prestige, which is earning status through genuine competence and contribution, that only happens with people. And what that means is people follow because they want to, not because they have to. And it's one of the things that makes us the most evolutionarily distinct. And yet, most of our organizations are structured to reward that dominance approach. So that approach works when you have leverage, but it doesn't tend to survive contact with conditions where people have real choices about where they work, which is really most situations. So what I push on in this conversation is whether this framework is actually available to leaders who need it most. So for instance, our research at Red Thread shows that manager effectiveness has been declining. And the reason is not that managers don't understand good leadership. It's because the volume of responsibilities we have placed on them has grown beyond what's sustainable, while the organizational support has actually been pulled back. So when Ben makes the case for prestige-based leadership, I wanted to know, is this something we're asking already overwhelmed people to add to their plate? His answer, I'm not going to tell you. It's worth hearing, and I suggest you listen carefully for it. Another thing we get into is trust, specifically where it lives in organizations and what happens when different levels work against each other. When senior leaders are making decisions that erode trust and managers are trying to hold things below together, but the question remains, are managers just really being the shock absorbers for the failures that originate above them? Ben doesn't sugarcoat this. He answers it pretty directly, and I'm not going to tell you the answer on this one either, but I really want you to listen for that one. And then finally, we talked a bit at the end of our conversation about AI, and specifically what Ben calls the degradation of high-fidelity communication. The concern that as we lean harder on AI and low-effort communication tools, we're actually eroding the thing that makes leadership works in the first place. So you're going to see some really interesting things in this session. I hope, and I'm sure that you will be able to apply some of them in your own organizations. And as always, we are so interested to hear what you take from this. Have a good listen, and we'll look forward to hearing it from you afterwards. Welcome to Workplace Stories, Ben. We are so excited to have you here with us today.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, we have brought you here to talk about your new book, plus lots of other things. But before we get there, I want to hear a bit about your work. And when I was reading your book, I was shocked to hear that in high school, you wanted to be a psychologist, and then you became a psychologist. So, who does that? Tell us all about yourself.
I think not many people, because even when I was in college, I was like, everybody's changing majors and I've never changed. And then I was the oddball. So yeah, so back when I was in like 10th grade, I took my first psychology class and realized, oh, this is for me. I'm endlessly curious. We'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure. But I was always really fascinated with people. Why do people do what they do? Why do we think the way they do? I was always curious, what's underneath that? Well, what's underneath that? Well, why? I was one of those annoying kids, right?
God bless your mother.
Yeah. Oh, God bless her. Yes. She had to deal with that. But yeah, like you said, I really felt I wanted to be a psychologist. And that was nurtured in me through my education. My mother was very emotionally attuned. She was an exceptional listener. I picked up on a lot of that stuff. I also have it in my genes. I'm adopted, and my biological family, I actually know them. I have a relationship with my birth mother and birth father. My birth mother's family is all like social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists. So it's kind of a little bit of a nature and a nurture thing there. So yeah, went into psychology, had my sights set on clinical psychology, very quickly realized that's not my jam. And so I discovered, it wasn't until I was a junior in college, I discovered this field of organizational psychology where you could apply the principles of psychology to the workplace. And I said, that's for me. I'm interested in that business psychology. So we were off and running, and had a bunch of different jobs in training and development, employee selection and assessments. And now I've been with Qualtrics for close to 11 years now. And I've had a bunch of different jobs in sales and professional services. And now I sit within our research institute doing research on human psychology in the workplace.
Awesome. So aside from the fact that you've been doing this since you're 15, why should our audience listen to you? Today, we're going to talk a little bit about management and leadership specifically. Why should our audience listen to you?
I would consider myself a scientist practitioner. I'm both. And so I like to dig very deep into topics. And anybody who's seen me talk, who's one-on-one in group settings, read my material, knows that I like to get nerdy and deep. But I also am very committed, and I put this lens on when I look at all of the work that I do, is how can I make that practical? And so is this reasonable? Is this practical, not just theoretical? So really what I think one of my gifts is I'm pretty good at bridging the gap between the two. I can go as deep as you want to go, nerdy as you want to get, but then I can bring it back up to a level and say, hey, look, here's some really practical ways to apply these theories or these really interesting insights. So that's not just like, oh, that was interesting, but I can actually go do something with this. So again, I think that's the big reason is I'm a scientist at heart, but also I'm a practitioner and have been for a very long time.
Cool. Well, let's turn to the book. Here it is for folks who are watching, A Leader Worth Following: How to Master Yourself, Influence Others, and Create Exceptional Experiences. Okay, so the book's central argument is that leadership is about earning followership rather than demanding it. So I would maybe put that as you are, pulling instead of pushing leaders along with you. And so you make a distinction in the book between prestige-based and dominance-based leadership. And as you were talking through it in the book, I was wondering, in practice, what does that difference look like? And why do so many leaders still default to the wrong one?
I'm going to go a little bit back to answer this because I think it's really interesting. And I'm going to come back to your question, Stacia, but I never actually intended to write this book. So I can go back 4.5 years to the start when this all started. At that time, I had zero intention of writing a book. I just got really interested. I was digging into a lot of our research, and I was interested in this question of what is it about companies that create really good experiences for their employees as rated by their employees, create really good consumer experiences as rated by their consumers, and make money. And we have a lot of data on that. So I was looking at all that research, and not very long after looking at all those studies, the answer was abundantly obvious. There's something different about the way those companies lead. There's something different about the way their leaders show up. And so that got me really interested. I started digging into the leadership literature. And because I wasn't planning on writing a book, I had no agenda. I just allowed my curiosity to go where it went. So that took me into all different fields that you probably saw this show up, Stacia, of evolutionary psychology, which I didn't even know that field existed, anthropology, leadership studies, of course, some subfields of physics, even. In this quest of like, well, what causes that? Well, what causes that? Well, why did that show up? Why do we show up today the way we do? Why do leaders show up the way we do today? And so in my study of that subfield of evolutionary psychology, which by the way, I got super fascinated with.
I'm reading Sapiens right now. And like that, I find myself like referring back to that mentally all the time when thinking about our work. So I can totally see how that happened.
Yes, exactly. I know exactly that text. But when I was looking at that field, I ran across this really interesting line of research that was looking at leadership. And it was a social psychologist named John Maynard. And he was distinguishing between these two approaches that humans use to achieve status in social groups. And so the first important premise is that all known human societies have social hierarchies. In other words, the leaders and followers can be found in any human society, primitive or industrial, even throughout history. That when we study, there's some degree of social hierarchy. Another premise is that it's better to be at the top or toward the top than at the bottom. A lot better access to resources in general. And so, but humans generally use these two strategies according to Maynard. One is, as you pointed out, dominance, and the other is prestige. Now, what got me really interested, was when I started looking at research from biology on other species. And what I found was that all social animals use dominance. And in other words, dominance is about there's an alpha, there's the crew that hangs with the alpha, and they impose their will on others. It's our way. We're going to do it our way, and I'm going to impose or threaten or use force against you if you don't like that. But then humans use this other strategy called prestige. And this is more about, like you said, it's not pushing people, it's pulling people along. What I found really fascinating was that humans use dominance, just like primates use dominance, just like crickets and crawfish and frogs and ducks and geese. There's nothing unique about it. There's nothing evolutionary unique about it. But prestige is only a strategy that humans consistently use, which suggests that it's powered by the more advanced and more recently evolved parts of the brain. In other words, it's what makes us uniquely human. It differentiates us from other species. So what does that look like today? I'll put it simply, dominance is kind of like your Bill Lumberghs, who they go around, they lead from the back, they impose normally psychological force against people, they put existential threats against them, and we follow those leaders because we might feel stuck, we might feel like we have to follow them. Prestigious-based leaders are those who possess some great talent or competence, and they add that to the value or the benefit of the group. We follow those people because we want to. We confer social status on those individuals. And those are the ones who lead from the front. They're the servant leaders. They're the ones that there's no job beneath that. They're going to get down and dirty, roll up their sleeves, and get in there with you. And we follow them because we want to.
So I think this is a really interesting idea, and I'm probably going to wander a little bit as I ask this question. We see dominance-based leaders everywhere, and we see people clamoring for dominance-based leadership. What about the prestige-based leadership? How does that show up differently than dominance?
This is a good point. There's a few things I think are worth pointing out. A lot of times, and even I was thinking this as I was studying this, is, okay, this sounds good, but this also sounds a little too good to be true. Like, okay, you post that on social and everybody likes it. Yay, okay. But let's get back to reality. And some cultures, it's very difficult to survive as a prestige-based leader. If you don't learn to play the politics, if you don't learn to play the game, you don't earn a seat at the table, right? Is a common argument. And I think you both pointed this out, that the dominance-based approaches, they work. That's a really important thing to note. It works for a while, and it works under certain conditions. In other words, when you have the leverage, when you have the power, when you have all the money, when you literally can control what happens to people, dominance works. And that's why we have many autocrats and tyrants, and we've had that throughout human history. But let me make a quick point, because I want to get to your key question here. I think a really interesting point. If you watch other species who use dominance, what always happens to the alpha, without exception? They eventually get taken over by a younger, stronger, more fit alpha. They always lose in the end, always. In the animal kingdom, the alpha game lasts for a while. It works. It's a short-term game. It works for a while, but then it doesn't. And I think that's a really important point. Why I think we're still seeing that needed in organizations, or wanted, maybe not needed, wanted or seeked out in organizations, is because it works now. And I would argue, I don't know if you all agree with your research, but it seems to me that leaders feel like they're under more pressure than they were yesterday and 5 years ago and 10 years ago. We have to get these results now. We have to get AI working now. We have to do this now. Show me what you did for me lately. Hit this quarterly number. I don't care what let's get it done now. And so that sort of environment lends itself to a dominance-based approach, because prestige-based leadership is a long-term game. Dominance is a short-term game. Right now, the rules of the game are sort of favoring the former.
So it seems like we set up organizations and we set up expectations to serve dominance. And then we layer on top this fluffy soft skill stuff like empathy and listening and emotional intelligence. Why? Why do organizations do that if we know that the system itself is set up so that those things aren't as valuable as the dominance-based things that we've put in place?
Yeah, well, I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is we're starting to realize there are very acute examples of dominance not working when you lose leverage. I remember back in the teens when Josh Bersin would say, the war for talent's over and talent won, right? And in those sorts of conditions, dominance doesn't work all that well, because you lose that leverage over people to feel like, well, I don't like this. I don't like being felt like I'm being threatened. I don't like feeling like I'm stuck. I have agency, and so I'm going to move elsewhere. We saw the same thing shortly after COVID, when people were really reevaluating their jobs and looking for value-based work. So under those conditions, it doesn't work very well. It certainly doesn't work well with customers. And so there's an awareness of that. But I think what you pointed out, Danny, is really important. Is like, we have set up the culture, the conditions to favor a style of leadership, but but also we need to show that we care about people. Let's train them to do that. That to me is backwards. And so what I like to do when I'm talking to organizations is to remind them, and I'm going to steal a cue from our joint good friend, Dr. Steve Hunt. I like his definition of an organization. It's a group of people using shared resources to accomplish a shared objective. I think that's a phenomenal, fundamental definition of what an organization is. Let's forget the metrics and stuff right now. Every organization exists to meet the needs of other people. And if it doesn't do that, it doesn't exist. So if you go back to the fundamentals and you ask the question, how do you get a group of people to work effectively together, use their resources efficiently, accomplish an inevitably human mission? Is it better to apply a bunch of force and make people feel stuck? No. There's a mountain of research that said, no, you do the opposite. You pull them along, you inspire them. And it's not like this is foreign stuff. We've had this research for a long time. So I like to turn that around and say, look, let's change the rules of the game. Now, the good news is, this is the last thing I'll say on this part. When we've done research on again, back to that question that started my exploration for the book, what is it about those companies that lead differently, that create better employee experiences and customer experiences and financial performance? We saw symptoms of prestige-based leadership, not dominant-based leadership. So that style of leadership does work. And I would argue it's going to work more effectively in the future we're going into.
So I want to dive in a little bit on this because a couple years ago, one of our mega trends was this idea of power struggle. And we talked about how basically the people, if you will, in the organization had a lot of the balance of the power for a while. And it felt like senior leaders were trying to wrest it from them. So thinking COVID, right? It was, we got to do everything to make people successful in this incredibly difficult environment, which we absolutely had to do. Then immediately coming out of that, we had the Great Resignation and a huge focus on DEIB with George Floyd, murder of George Floyd, et cetera. And Danny and I remember us talking about this, Danny, the day that Elon Musk fired half of Twitter employees, I was like, this is a power thing. This is a hammer coming down, and we're going to see every set of senior leaders who secretly were feeling like they were out of control, returning to a dominance control mindset. And I think that's what we've seen. So my question, there is a question here, is what do we do when the leaders who have gotten to the top got to the top through dominance, not through prestige? And that is their immediate gut reaction. What do we do for those leaders lower in the organization who are trying to learn and all they're seeing is dominant approaches above them and not prestige approaches?
What, by the way, your visual, I've always thought of it as this pendulum that swings back and forth over time, very similar to the imagery. And I agree, that's very much what I've witnessed as well. But it does swing back and forth. That's an important thing. Over time, it does swing back and forth. Very rarely does it stay on one side. It always pulls back and then it pulls back and it pulls back. Because humans, of course, we can't find the equilibrium. But to your question, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's incredibly difficult to do. But I think about it in terms of using that, ubiquitous term culture that sometimes we all know the word, but it's defined very differently. I like to think of culture as the shared behavioral norms and mindsets that exist in the organization. Let's say you're in a culture where it does favor dominance-based leadership from the top down. You have a lot of dominantly inclined leaders. That's who gets promoted. That's who gets identified. That's the style that permeates throughout the top of the organization. That's going to put a lot of pressure. It creates the environmental conditions that make it very difficult for a prestige-based leader to operate. But it doesn't make it impossible. And so this is one of the important things. I think I use this all the time because I work with leaders at all different levels, from the C-suite to the middle management down to the front line. And what I always suggest to them is you might absolutely be operating, with leaders above you who are dominant. A couple of things I would suggest. One, understand their game. Understand the tactics they use and start to explore, how does that affect you as an individual, as a leader? How does it affect other people? Look for the tactics, break them down. What behaviorally are they doing? What are they saying? How are they saying it? What are the tactics? Understand their game. And then know how to play it, but intentionally don't. And preserve a healthy climate inside of this culture that may not be healthy, or it might be toxic, or it might be dominantly inclined. Is it possible to do? Absolutely. Is it easy to do? Absolutely not. It's very difficult to do. But I would also argue, and this is kind of my point of inspiration for those leaders, because I've seen it done. I've seen it done really well. Little climates that are healthy can chip away at a broader culture that's unhealthy. It absolutely can happen, and I've seen it happen. But my little point of inspiration and feel good for the prestige-based leaders fighting a good fight. That's a much harder path and a far more courageous path to take. Because to be a prestige-based leader in a dominantly inclined culture, you have to be a badass. You have to be highly competent. You do. If you're not highly competent, you're going to get out. You're going to get moved out. But if you are highly competent, you start to study the tactics, you know their game, you know how to play, you can play those politics, but you intentionally don't unless you absolutely need to. you can create a really healthy climate within a tough culture. Last little analogy I like to use, and I use this in the body language chapter of the book, because I think that's a key set of skills to doing exactly what I just described. How to operate in a dominant inclined body language is a good one. But I like to talk about, imagine, you have a bunch of sheep with a bunch of wolves. Who are the wolves going to go after? They're going to go after the weak ones. They're going to go after the lost sheep. What they're not going to do is attack the big horned ram minding its business, who's not threatening to the wolf. It's not going to mess with that ram. It's going to go after the sheep. And the ram is who I think the prestige-based leaders need to be. I'm not talking about soft, fluffy, weak people. I'm talking about badasses who really work really hard, who have exceptional skills, who use those skills to benefit the group, and who understand the game, the bigger game that they're in, and how to play by those rules too, but intentionally don't.
Can I just say, I think that sounds exhausting.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
So you've thrown off my thesis a little bit here, which is that people may already know how to do some of this stuff, but don't. I'm not sure they know how to do this, but I'm still going to go back to my question that gets at systems. And that question is, in our research, we have seen, similar to what I know you've seen, Ben, that trust and manager effectiveness are declining. But the reason for that has largely not been, or at least not solely, let's put it that way, because those folks don't know how to lead or how to be good managers. It's because the volume of responsibilities, particularly go back to that timeline, COVID, you're now your employees, emotional support, you're their connection to the organization, you're their coach, et cetera. Then great resignation, you're the one who has to keep them engaged, et cetera, et cetera. And then now we got to drive productivity, like all this stuff, but the old stuff doesn't come off. So we're putting more stuff on them. But at the same time, because we have to be more efficient, we are pulling away support in the system. And so in our research, it was actually fascinating. We could see where all was I wouldn't say great, but okay. And then the organization pulled away the support and managers held for a year in their effectiveness. And then the next year, they dropped because they just couldn't hold out against the system. And so my question here is are we actually just throwing something more on their plate? This is how it ties back to what Danny said. Because this sounds tiring. This sounds exhausting. So are we just giving them more when they've already had so much more put on their plate?
You could view it that way. And I think it's a fair challenge because, Danny, I think you're exactly right. It is exhausting. But we have to do some reflection here of okay, well, what's the most productive response? Do we just go with it and just succumb to the dominance-based leadership, take the quick fix pill and just do what everybody else is doing? That's probably the easiest way to go for a while. Do we just get out of the organization? Which ideally maybe that is a good option. I'm not saying don't do that. But for some people, they may not be able to. What's the approach? So the way I think about that question, Stacia, is I don't view, when I was thinking about all the things that are in the book, I view them as fundamental, foundational leadership skills, not at that same altitude as, oh, here's one more set of things I have to add to my plate, but rather these skills, these tactics are going to actually help me do all the rest of the stuff that's put on my plate better. And also, not to relieve myself of the pressure and the burnout that's inevitably going to come, but maybe to reframe those things and to be able to face them with more equanimity or look at them from a different perspective. And I could say from my personal experience, and not just in my work, but the process of going through the book and writing the book, it has completely changed the way I look at work. That would stress me out for days 2 years ago. I don't even think about it that way. I experience less stress for less periods of time. And it's not because anything's changed with what's coming on my plate. It's just how I look at it differently. I look at it very differently. It's also completely changed my marriage in a much better way. My relationship with my children is much better. And so I think what I would say is the things that we talk about through the book, don't think of them as one more thing on my plate, but rather this is the job. if you're a leader in an organization, whether it's a frontline leader, maybe you're an individual contributor, but you're highly influential and you have to lead and influence others. That's the job. All the stuff that gets assigned to you, that's the stuff you have to do, part of your job. But all these tactics are going to help you face those things with more equanimity, with maybe a different perspective. And they might help reduce some of the long-term effects of the stress and the emotion that you would experience.
I think I need to write a book.
You do that.
If it's going to improve my relationship with my spouse, my children, my work, I'm in.
We have a really good friend. This just reminded me of a conversation we had with him. We were doing drinks in New York last time we were both there. And he said, he's kind of at the end part of his career. And he said, the ultimate flex for somebody at my age is to be an individual contributor. I wonder if you have a response to that.
Oh, I will say this. I deeply resonate with that. When I talk to people who have managed teams of teams, who've been senior leaders in organizations, they talk about being a senior individual contributor as quote unquote the dream. Because, look, leading people's really hard. It's really hard. And prestige-based leadership is harder, but it's more rewarding and it's more effective in the long run.
Well, let's move over to our lightning round questions and get to know you a little bit better, Ben. So the first question we have here is, what movie title best describes your life?
Oh, that's a tough one. Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Why?
Firstly, it's an awesome show. And I don't necessarily think of myself as Indiana Jones. I'm not that cool. But I do resonate with like this constant search for something deep and mystical and historical, because that's going back to my interest in psychology. What's underneath that? And what's underneath that? But also, even as a trained scientist, I also have a very deep respect for things that are beyond science or our current tools of measurement in science, and have a real deep interest in epistemology. How do we know what we know? And how do we just a deep respect for the truths that we don't see or sense that are underneath it all. So yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, good. What subject do you wish was taught in every school?
Rhetoric and body language. And they used to be taught in ancient Greece. And then the elites during the medieval times and the Enlightenment, they said, oh, that's too dangerous. We're going to keep that to ourselves. And so now we don't talk about those things. And I think those things are incredibly important.
Well, this is probably a nice lead-in then. Would you rather speak 10 languages or play 10 instruments?
10 instruments, because then I could speak to everybody.
Oh, that was beautiful.
I love that. Okay, let's continue with this discussion. And I want to pick back up on the systems question, which is really about what happens. Right now we're in this incredibly tension-filled time. And so what happens when some of these levels are actively working against each other? So like when you have senior leaders making decisions that erode trust, and then the managers are trying to hold it together. They're trying to be prestige, inspirational, all that stuff. But like the organization isn't, senior leadership's not really helping them. So are those leaders, those managers just kind of getting set up for failure? And is there organizational accountability for trying to fix this problem?
Yeah, I do think that's the accountability rests at the very top of the organization for that, but that's sort of the easy answer. Then that's also the hard.
I was going to say, so then if you're in one of these organizations, you're just stuck. Yeah.
But I also think in my experience, we've talked a lot on the extremes in this discussion so far. Even me, I think we've talked a lot about how, you have a healthy culture or you have a good manager who's trying to do the right thing in a terrible environment. That absolutely happens. But more often than not, I think it's sort of, there's a mix of good and bad in most organizations. It's not all bad. You don't have total jerks running the show at the top. I've seen that before, but it's pretty rare, honestly. What I see mostly is well-intended people under a tremendous amount of pressure who are trying to do things quickly, and they don't exactly do it the right way. That's, I think, is more common. Let me speak to those leaders. If you're a leader in a really, really toxic environment, get out. If you're in the more realistic scenario where you have, leaders, they're really trying, but they're also under a tremendous amount of pressure, just firstly realize it's going to be difficult. It's going to be harder for you. You might be the bearer of the bad news. You might be trying to explain something that you don't have full accountability over, or a decision you don't have accountability over. I don't really have like any quick fixes for this aside from, I've been that leader in the past. And what I've learned through my reading, through my research, and through my own practice is being certain about the uncertainty that you're in with your team. I think we may talk about uncertainty a little bit more, but that is something I think as a leader, you work your best to reduce. Creating environments where this is a tactic I think works really well. Creating environments where you give people the freedom to just openly vent, name their emotions, say how they feel. And a lot of leaders say, like, I don't want to hear problems. I want to hear solutions. It's like, that's great. I'm one of those leaders too. But carve out 15 minutes for your one-on-one and say, for the first 15 minutes, let me know what you need to say. Just say what you need to say. And then we're going to stop it. And then we'll talk about what we do about it together. It's amazing what that little freedom that a leader gives people to do. It's amazing how cathartic and therapeutic it is. Don't underestimate it. If you think that's a self-help suggestion, go try it and see what happens. It's incredibly powerful.
It works with my 5-year-old. So yeah. Back to Stacia's point on just some of these just seem like good ideas for communication and respecting each other's space in the world. Talk to me a little bit about leadership development. So Stacia made the point, maybe people don't know how to do this prestige leadership. You mentioned in your book that we should be creating environments to bring out the best in people. How would an organization go about doing that? And as a follow-up, who's responsible for making sure that happens?
That's a good question, because I think some people would say it's everybody's responsibility. But I think it's well said, if it's everybody's responsibility, then it's no one's. And I think that's very real. I will first say I don't think this is HR's responsibility. I do think HR needs to be a catalyst for it. They need to be measuring it. They need to call it out. But that's a leader responsibility. And in the areas you can control, I am a believer in control what you can control, chip away at it, build from the inside out if you're in one of those tough environments. But to answer that question, Danny, in the research I was doing, this is probably one of the biggest mindset shifts I had as part of studying for this book is I am so much more appreciative of how influential the environment is to directing human behavior than I was before. Even as a psychologist, I'd look at leaders, politicians, and say, how could they do that? I would never do that. Thinking of myself as like this stable, good person, regardless of the environment of the situation. And I would certainly feel this same way even if I was over there, if I was born over there. And now when I think about those scenarios, I'm like, I'm not so sure. And some people argue with me about this, and they say, well, no, we have personal agency, and I agree with this. We have to choose. But how many of us have been in those situations where we find ourselves in a new environment and it just starts to chip away at us gradually over time until a few years later we look in the mirror and we're like, I don't recognize what I'm looking at. I've become a different person. I've seen that happen to friends. I've seen that happen to family. I've seen it happen to myself. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we probably all have had some experiences like that. And so one of the pieces of personal agency, I'm going to get to your question, Danny, like what can we do in the environment? But piece of advice I would give to people is appreciate the power of the environment on your own behavior and the behavior of others. What they see and perceive, what you see and perceive in the environment has a huge influence on their behavior. And denying that fact, I'm going to say fact, makes you more susceptible to it. Actually acknowledging that and being on the lookout for it, looking out for those environments that are healthy for you or unhealthy, choosing to remove yourself from unhealthy ones, for example, That's where our personal agency can come in. So yeah, I am a big believer in personal agency. So back to that question, like, how do we do that? I really like, and I use this imagery in the book of, the Edgar Schein's levels of culture, where you have the artifacts, those are the visible representations of your culture, your climate. If you're a smaller team, you have your values underneath the surface. And then below that, really deep, is your underlying beliefs. And what I think a lot of people, even me, when I start looking at that imagery, I start thinking like, oh, start with the underlying beliefs. But I think the artifacts ultimately matter the most. What do people actually visibly see and experience and perceive, and acknowledging the effect it has on people's behavior? So a couple quick tips here. In your virtual backgrounds and your physical backgrounds, if you want to be viewed as transparent, if you believe in transparency, do the physical cues around you, your meeting room, is your door literally open? Do you have an open door policy but your door is always closed, or it's not glass, right? It's a good example. If you are transparent with people and they walk into your office and you have a big desk that sits between you and the other person, remove that physical barrier. That physical barrier might be sending a cue to the other person's unconscious mind. So these sorts of little micro cues, these artifacts that represent what you want people to view you as a leader, are really, really important. And they also signal what behaviors are permissible at an unconscious level. So I think when we talk about environment, I really encourage leaders, start with the physical environment that they create and they're in. How do they show up physically? That sends a lot of signals and direction to other people that's going to influence them, what they say, what they do, and how they behave.
So how do you do that systemically? Like if if nobody's in charge of it, if everyone's in charge of it, nobody's in charge of it, right? I can see that working for an individual who wants to be a prestige leader. I'm wondering how you do it for an organization. How do you make sure that those physical cues are in place? How do you make sure that leaders are responding the way that they need to? How do you create the environment for the leaders to have the behaviors that you need them to have in order to be prestige?
Right. I think in an ideal world, that starts all the way at the top with the setting of the core values of the company. Like, this is an exercise I've seen some of my clients, even the company I work for, go through, of saying, okay, well, what are our core values, right? That middle level of culture, using Schein's imagery and terminology. With those values, what represents that value? I'll give a good example, and I use this in the book, of transparency, right? We're transparent. We talk open and honestly. Okay, what would be visible, observable, measurable artifacts that people could directly perceive? When you walk into some companies' headquarters, the walls are glass. It's a great example, right? That could be an expensive change. I'm not suggesting you go do that, but do the physical artifacts reflect that value of transparency? When you do a company webcast, do you actually have an open Q&A? Does it do the exec answer those questions? That would be another directly observable artifact. I would start there. I would say, for any very senior leaders or HR professionals who are influencing the senior leaders, go to those core values and really do an audit of, do the physical manifestations of these, do we have proper physical manifestations of these in the organization? Do we measure it in our employee measures? Do we measure it in our customer measures, for example?
And I want to build on that, because you've talked a lot about some of the physical artifacts, but I want to talk just a minute about the digital ones, right? Like, I remember when I joined a large organization and I had to submit expenses, and the amount of documentation for like a $20 meal. But like, what does that say about the trust that the organization puts in the individual? And I just remember thing after thing, I would be like, what do you think I'm going to do that is going to harm you so much that you have to have these, digital gates and whatever in place? And I imagine someone just said, oh, well, it's going to be easier if we do yada, yada, and we have it documented. Not that we don't trust our people, but it sent the signal to me that I was not trusted. And so as we are looking forward, AI accelerates everything and all of these decisions. And often, with the person typing in, give me ideas on how to better understand our spend. It's not going to get the, hey, you're going to take the trust out of the system alert. And so as we're thinking about AI and this human-centered leadership problem, like, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's going to make it better? Do you think it's going to make it worse? Like, how do we manage this?
This is a good question. I'll start by saying a lot of the data that I'm seeing on the consumer side about these digital experience, AI-driven experiences has not been good. Companies are moving very quickly to automate, to turn things over to agentic. And thus far, consumers are less than impressed, especially with AI-driven customer service experience.
Oh, I've raised my fist at these.
They're less than impressed. Actually, you used the trust example with the expense reports. I think that is a key here, is that companies are not earning the trust. And in particular, I like one of the models of trust that I really like is from Mayer Davison Shorman that looks at 3 lenses of trust. You have to be competent in order to be trusted. You have to have integrity. In other words, you have to do what you say you're going to do, and you have to be consistent. But then the third category, which is the lowest rated among employees of their senior leaders and among consumers of organizations, is benevolence. In other words, what's the implied motive of your decision? So, Stacia, in your example, what's the implied motive of making you go back and forth on a $20 expense report? Who is that for? Is that for me to make my life better? No, it's to make somebody's job easier, right? So a lot of consumers are looking at it that way. Back to your question, Stacia, what I think is going to happen, well, I'll say, I don't know, but I can see a real positive and I can see some real negatives. On the positive, I think one of the things that AI has really forced us to do is to take account of what makes us as humans unique to organizations. How do we uniquely add value above and beyond these agents that can presumably do a lot of the jobs we used to do? That is a scary thing, but it's also really important and has some potential positive implications because it may actually lead us to lean more into those uniquely human skills, which I would argue correlate pretty strongly with prestige-based leadership and the behaviors that we see among the highest performing companies in employee experience, customer experience, and financial outcomes. So that's a potentially really good outcome. And I hope we do see some of that. On the negative end, I do think the pressure that leaders are feeling to get faster, do it faster, get more efficient, save more money, and also what an AI sort of these, and also communication technologies sort of nudge us away from what I would call high fidelity communication. Use some examples here. And these are legit concerns I have, which is what happens to an organization long term when we used to get around a meeting table to discuss issues, which suddenly gets people bought in, people feel heard. We start discussing building a shared mental model, a mental representation that's shared among us of what problem we need to solve and how we need to solve it. What happens when we start bypassing that because it's easier to just get AI to bat it around? We might get to an output that looks really good at first, and maybe it does create some efficiency at the beginning. But what happens to that ability to get people to work effectively together to create a shared mission when we remove all that? Oh, that's a waste of time. Is it? What happens when we start to lean on AI to do our judgment and thinking for us? I'll go back a few years. We did a study of employees and executives. This was 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So generative AI was becoming very mainstream. Agentic was still right around the corner. And we went out to frontline employees and we said, hey, how do you feel about AI? How would you describe it? The modal response was scared. The modal response among executives was excited. And we went to them and we said, well, why? Why are you so excited? Things are going to happen faster. We'll get more work done. We'll be more effective. Okay, sounds great. Employees, why are you scared? First concern, I'm scared of losing my job. Second biggest concern, I'm scared of the workplace losing its sense of humanity. The third concern, I'm scared that humans are going to lose their critical thinking skills. Fast forward to today. How well did they predict what was going to happen? Pretty well.
Well, that was a downer, Ben. We want to ask one more question before we leave. And maybe this is a good chance for you to give some advice to CHROs. What's one thing you think that they should stop doing? And what's one thing that you think that they should start doing to improve leadership quality in their organizations?
Yeah, I think a couple of things I would say. One thing I would stop doing is basing performance management solely on results and outcomes. And start also, those are important. I'm not saying don't do those, but I'm saying don't solely look at that. Also look at how. Okay, great. You hit your number. How? Did you do it ethically? Did you do it in a way that was consistent with our core values of customer first? Did you do it in a way that was coercive to customers or to employees? Did you game the system? So how you did it is really critical. So I would move away from performance managed systems that only focus on what got produced or what the results were. I'm a big fan of results, but I'm also a big fan of the process you went through to get to those results. I think that's really critical, especially in culture building. Another thing I would stop doing, please stop chasing scores in employee surveys and customer surveys. When you do that, you unknowingly tamper with the numbers and the scores become meaningless. So the most useful scores are honest scores. Promote honesty, promote cultures that I don't care what the scores are. I want you to be honest. Then your scores actually mean something and you do some really cool stuff with it. What I would do immediately, I would go back to my lightning round answer, implement training on rhetoric, executive presence, body language required for every leader. When they get hired, when they get promoted, that should be required of all leaders, is learn what are some basic body language tactics and appreciating how the way you show up physically is going to affect the mindsets of other people. It is an incredibly powerful tool. One quick insight from my study that I think will back up this point. Humans only learned to talk and listen to each other 100 to 200,000 years ago. We've been communicating nonverbally for millions of years. So our brains are far more attuned, and largely unconsciously, to nonverbal communication. And that's why it's often said more gets communicated nonverbally than verbally. But today, back to your question about AI, Stacia, I think a lot of our new technologies are nudging us toward, if I need to exchange the message, I just send a text, or I send a Slack, or I send an email, or whatever, or a Teams message, whatever it might be, nudging us toward lower fidelity communication. There's absolutely nothing wrong with those tools. I use them daily, and we need to use them. But also question, is that the best way to create a vivid mental image in the minds of the people I'm trying to communicate with? And I think body language, rhetoric, executive presence training should be required for all leaders.
I think the other part of that, you mentioned kind of nudging us down, but then there's even the degradation of the language, because you think about talk to text. I use talk to text all the time. And I'm going to give it a solid 20% it messes up. And of those messes up, I don't catch them all. And small things that matter, like I'll say someone's name, and Ben, it's usually going to get right. But if I say Christina, did it spell it with the H or did it spell it only with the CR? And if I spelled it wrong, it shows that I'm not paying attention to the other person. Even if I didn't mean it, even if I know that Christina's name is CHR, not CR, it degrades because of the speed. So that's one thing. And then the second thing on this is, as we use generative AI to write things, the precise words are not my precise words. So a word that maybe has a slightly different connotation, but I glance at it and say, oh, that's close enough. But it degrades the fidelity, the quality of the communication. So I think there's even more to this than just the fact that it's a text message. It is and sorry for anybody I've done this to, potentially a sloppily written AI-infused text message that doesn't actually reflect who I am. And so going back to your point, in relationships where there's already high trust, I'm like, I know Stacia knows how to spell my name. Like, that must have been something silly. They give me the benefit of the doubt. But if it's a new relationship, if it's somebody I don't already know, it's going to potentially get a little bit more like, did she really mean that? Is that really what she was trying to say? Like, did she really decide not to pay attention to how I spell my name? I might be harping on this because I have a funny name and people mess it up all the time, but you get that point. So it's interesting.
That's a really good point. I can't say it aloud because it's a little too rough, but my wife had a really funny experience recently. We were just joking about it with our friends, close friends of ours. She was using the talk to text and she used their last name. And without looking, she sent it and she gets back like, what? Like it's laughing faces, what? And it was like, changed the last name to 2 expletives. So I won't say it on the podcast, but it was hilarious. Now, to your point, we know those people, it was hilarious. We were joking around, but what if you don't?
Yeah. What if you don't?
What if you do that with a customer?
I think that there's a whole bunch of communication changes and norm changes that we're going to come across, and some of them probably aren't going to be good, and we're going to have to deal with that. Ben, as always, we could talk forever, but I think, unfortunately, we are coming here to the end. And so I want to ask you, actually, I'm going to do just 2 follow-up questions to wrap our time. And the first one is, if our listeners had just one takeaway from your book, from your experience, what would you want that to be?
I use this a lot for this question. I'm going to do it again because I think it's just such an important point, especially as we just talked about with communication. One of my favorite quotes of all time comes from the great cosmologist Stephen Hawking. And that is, mankind's greatest achievements have come about by talking, its greatest failures by not talking. All we need to do is make sure we keep talking. And I think as we start to get in this world where everything's automated, it's all quick, we're using talk to text, we're using AI to do our work for us, let's not lose that fundamental, incredibly important, visceral, primal experience of communication. I think that is one of the greatest risks that we run into. But if we do that, if we keep talking, our AI is actually going to be better. It's going to help us better. We're going to be able to use it better. Good things are going to happen.
Okay. And final question, Ben, is the one that we ask every podcast guest. That's the purpose question. It's, why do you do the work that you do?
I fundamentally believe that work should make people healthy, happy in the true sense of the word, long-term fulfillment and contentment, and healthy and happy, and bring people long-term contentment. I don't think should be looked at as, I got to do this. I'm doing it because I have to. I'm doing it to survive. Unfortunately, a lot of us do. A lot of us are in that situation, and I don't think it needs to be. And so my goal is to help people see that there's deeper meaning in work, and also help leaders see that there's deeper meaning in work, and that they can create environments that make people happy, healthy, and productive. And that's actually good for business.
Dr. Ben Granger, thank you so much for being with us today on Workplace Stories.
Thank you, my friend.
Thanks for listening. If this podcast got you thinking differently about how work happens, that's what we're here for. We dig into these topics every week in our research and in the Red Thread community. The Red Thread community is a place where people, leaders, and practitioners come together to compare notes, share what's working, and maybe challenge those things that aren't working so well. You can join for free at redthreadresearch.com/membership. Or if you or your organization are ready to go deeper, take a look at our professional and our enterprise memberships. For professional tier, for listeners, you can use the promotional code STORIES, STORIES, for a 10% discount. And if you're a tech provider trying to make sense of this space, our tech consortium is where smart vendors are coming together to learn from each other and from the market. You'll find everything at redthreadresearch.com. I'm Danny Johnson. Thanks for listening and for caring about making work better.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcasts so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.